nobody believed Dr. Sarah Chen when she warned them about what was coming. 3 months before the world ended, she stood before the United Nations Assembly Hall in New York, her hands trembling slightly as she presented satellite images showing strange fungal patterns spreading across remote villages in Eastern Europe. The delegates looked at her with polite smiles that barely concealed their impatience. They called her paranoid behind closed doors. They whispered that she was a conspiracy theorist who had spent too many years studying infectious diseases in isolation. They thanked her for her dedication and sent her home with empty promises to investigate her findings further. Now, as Sarah watched London burn from the rooftop of an abandoned hospital, flames reflecting in her exhausted eyes, she understood that being right was the worst feeling she had ever experienced in her entire life. The infection had started in a small village in Romania, a place so remote that it didn't appear on most maps. A mysterious pathogen, unlike anything science had ever documented, began rewriting human neural pathways within hours of exposure. The infected didn't die. That would have been merciful, a clean ending that humanity could have mourned and moved past. Instead, they transformed into something primal, something that existed only to feed and spread. Their eyes turned milky white, losing all traces of the person they had once been. Their movements became jerky and unpredictable, driven by instincts that no longer belonged to humanity, and they developed an insatiable hunger for living flesh that drove them forward through any obstacle. The media called them zombies because humanity desperately needed a familiar word for the nightmare they could uncomprehend. Scientists initially rejected the term, insisting on clinical descriptions that no one could remember. But within days, as the horrors spread across borders and oceans, everyone simply called them what they were: the Walking Dead. They infected. The end of everything humanity had built over thousands of years. Within 6 weeks of the first confirmed case, 60% of the global population had fallen to the infection. Governments collapsed as leaders fled or transformed. Military defenses crumbled, despite every weapon humanity possessed. Because how do you fight an enemy that feels no pain, no fear, and never stops coming? The infected moved in massive hordes, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, drawn to sound and body heat, overwhelming every fortress and safe zone that survivors constructed. Sarah pulled her worn coat tighter against the cold November wind, her breath forming small clouds in the darkness. Somewhere in the streets below, she could hear them moving through the abandoned city. Thousands of shuffling feet, dragging across broken pavement, guttural moans that echoed through empty streets and shattered windows. The massive horde was moving east, following the sound of distant explosions, where the remaining military forces were making their desperate last stand. At the Dover coastline, her radio crackled to life, startling her so badly that she nearly dropped it over the building's edge. "Dr. Chen, are you still alive?" The voice was familiar, though distorted by static and distance. She grabbed the device with shaking hands. "Marcus, I thought you were dead. The Cambridge facility was overrun 3 weeks ago. No time for reunions or explanations. We escaped through the underground tunnels. Listen to me carefully, Sarah. We found something in our research, something that might change everything, something that might actually save what's left of humanity. Get to the Cambridge facility, whatever it takes. However long it takes, just get here." The radio went dead before she could respond. The journey to Cambridge took Sarah for agonizing days. 4 days of hiding in shadows and abandoned buildings while hordes passed by outside. 4 days of holding her breath until her lungs burned as infected individuals stood inches away from her hiding spots, their milky eyes scanning for any sign of movement. For days of watching fellow survivors she encountered along the way, fall one by one to the endless tide of the infected. An elderly man who coughed at the wrong moment, a young mother who left her hiding spot to search for food for her children, a teenage boy who simply gave up and walked into the horde with empty eyes. When Sarah finally reached the hidden underground bunker beneath Cambridge University's biology department, she found Marcus Wong waiting at the entrance with 12 other scientists. They were the last remaining experts in neurology, virology, and acoustic engineering from across Europe, brought together by desperation and the faintest hope that science could still save them. Marcus looked older than she remembered. His hair now completely gray, though he was only 4. Deep lines carved his face, and his eyes carried the weight of everyone he had lost. But beneath the exhaustion, Sarah saw something else, something that looked almost like hope. He led her to a makeshift laboratory where a young woman sat hunched over a computer screen, surrounded by equipment salvaged from the destroyed university above. "Show her what we found," Marcus said quietly. "Show her everything." Dr. Priya Sharma was barely 28 years old, but she moved with the confidence of someone who knew she held humanity's last chance in her hands. She pulled up a complex waveform pattern on the screen, colors dancing across the display in intricate patterns that seemed almost alive. "We've been studying captured infected subjects in our containment area," Priya explained, her voice rapid with excitement and fear. "Their brains aren't dead, Dr. Chen. That's what everyone assumed, but they were wrong. The pathogen doesn't kill the brain. It creates a bioelectric field that overrides conscious thought, essentially taking control of the entire nervous system. It turns humans into vessels driven purely by the most basic survival instincts: hunger, movement, spread." Sarah studied the data carefully, her scientific mind already racing through the implications. "So they're essentially being controlled by a frequency, like a radio signal controlling a receiver." "Exactly like that. The pathogen generates a specific electromagnetic frequency that hijacks neural pathways and suppresses higher brain function. The person is still in there, trapped inside their own body, but they can't break through the signal." Priya pressed a button, and a sound filled the underground room. It was a low, oscillating tone that seemed to vibrate through Sarah's bones, resonating at a frequency she felt more than heard. On the computer screen, brain activity patterns of the infected test subjects began to shift dramatically. The chaotic signals generated by the pathogen weakened and fragmented. Normal human brain patterns started emerging, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "We call it the Chen frequency," Marcus said with a tired but genuine smile. "We named it after you. After the woman who saw this disaster coming when everyone else refused to listen." Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes, but refused to let them fall. "Can we broadcast this globally? Can we reach every infected person on Earth? That's the problem we haven't solved." Priya's hopeful expression darkened considerably. "We need massive transmission power to make this work. Every satellite still in orbit, every radio tower still standing, every speaker system on Earth would need to work simultaneously at maximum power. The frequency must reach every single infected individual at exactly the same moment across the entire planet. If we miss any significant population of infected, they will simply reinfect anyone we manage to cure. We would be right back where we started, within weeks. How do we possibly coordinate something of that scale when there's no functioning government, no reliable communication network, no infrastructure?" Marcus placed a worn, hand-drawn map on the table in front of her. "There are 7 major broadcast stations worldwide that survived the collapse and still have power: Beijing, Moscow, Sydney, Johannesburg, São Paulo, Toronto, and here in Cambridge. Each station needs to be reached and activated manually at precisely the same moment, synchronized to the second." Sarah stared at the map, calculating distances and dangers in her mind. "That's impossible. The infected are everywhere. We don't have enough people, enough vehicles, enough weapons." "That's our only chance," Marcus replied firmly. "Impossible is all we have left." They called the plan Operation Last Frequency, and they gave themselves 72 hours to execute it. 7 teams departed Cambridge within hours, each carrying radio equipment, the frequency generator specifications, and enough supplies to survive the journey. They represented every remaining scientist, soldier, and survivor who had gathered at the facility. 23 people in total, racing across a destroyed world to save what remained of humanity. Sarah led the Moscow team personally, traveling through infected Europe with 3 other survivors who had volunteered for what everyone acknowledged might be a suicide mission. James was a former British soldier who had watched his entire squad transform in front of him during the first weeks of the outbreak. His eyes were haunted, but his hands were steady and his determination was unbreakable. May was a 16-year-old girl from Manchester who had survived alone for 3 weeks after losing her parents, her brother, and everyone else she had ever loved. Victor was a Russian engineer who had been attending a conference in London when the outbreak began and had spent months trying to return to Moscow to find his family. They traveled at night when the infected moved slower and their senses seemed dulled by the darkness. They communicated with other teams through carefully timed radio bursts, brief windows where they confirmed their progress and received updates from around the world. The Beijing team had reached their station. The Sydney team was making good progress. The Snow Palo team had lost 2 members, but was still moving forward. In Germany, they lost James. A massive horde blocked their only route through a destroyed city, and someone needed to create a distraction. James volunteered before anyone else could speak. He ran in the opposite direction, firing his weapon and screaming to draw the infected away from his team. His screams echoed through the empty streets long after Sarah May and Victor escaped into the darkness. They never stopped to mourn because stopping meant dying. In Poland, May Neely gave up entirely. Sarah found her standing at a bridge's edge late one night, staring down at the infected masses moving through the valley below like a river of death. The girl's face was blank, emptied of everything except exhaustion and grief. "What's the point of any of this?" May asked without turning around. "Even if we somehow succeed, look at what's left of the world. Ruins everywhere. Death everywhere. Nothing worth saving. Nothing worth living for." Sarah moved carefully to stand beside her, close enough to grab her if necessary. "When I was your age, my mother told me something that I've never forgotten, not even during the worst moments of this nightmare. She said that humanity isn't defined by our buildings or our technology or our accomplishments. Those things can all be destroyed and rebuilt. Humanity is defined by our refusal to surrender when everything tells us we should. Every single person we save tomorrow carries within them the potential for 1,000 future generations. Children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren spreading out into a future we can't even imagine. That potential is worth fighting for. That hope is worth living for." May stood motionless for a long moment, wind whipping her dark hair around her face. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, she stepped back from the edge. They kept moving toward Moscow. December 3rd arrived with freezing rain and a sky the color of ash. At 11:57 p.m. local time, Sarah stood in the Moscow broadcast station with her finger hovering over the activation switch. Victor had worked through the entire night without rest, repairing damaged equipment with spare parts they had salvaged from destroyed electronics stores along their route. The systems were operational, but barely. Any number of things could fail at the critical moment. Her radio crackled with check-ins from around the world, voices tense with exhaustion and desperate hope. "Beijing. Ready? Sydney. Ready? Johannesburg. Ready? São Paulo. Ready? Toronto. Ready? Cambridge. Ready?" Silence stretched through the radio connection. Sarah could hear infected pounding on the station's reinforced doors behind her, their moans filling the building with sound. The barriers would hold for maybe 10 more minutes before the horde broke through. This was truly their only chance. "Moscow. Ready," she finally said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. Marcus's voice came through the radio, calmer than she expected from a man holding the fate of humanity in his hands. "On my mark. 3, 2, 1. Activate." Sarah pressed the switch. The Chen frequency erupted from every speaker, every radio, every satellite dish still functioning on Earth. A wave of sound washed across the planet simultaneously, invisible and inaudible to normal human perception but devastating to the pathogen's bioelectric control signal. In an instant, the frequency reached billions of infected individuals across every continent, every country, every city. Through the station's reinforced windows, Sarah watched the infected horde outside freeze their pounding on the doors stopped. Their milky white eyes flickered strangely, clouding and clearing and clouding again. Some collapsed to the ground immediately. Others stood motionless, swaying gently like trees, responding to an invisible wind. Then, slowly, impossibly, miraculously, their eyes began to clear. Color returned to milky whiteness. Awareness replaced empty hunger. Humanity emerged from the prison the pathogen had created. A woman outside the station looked down at her blood-covered hands and began to scream. Not with hunger, but with horror at what she saw. A man fell to his knees on the broken pavement, weeping uncontrollably as memories flooded back. Children stood confused and terrified, calling for parents they couldn't find. All across Moscow, across London, across every city and village on Earth. Billions of people woke from a nightmare they couldn't remember, but somehow felt in their bones. Sarah slid down the wall until she sat on the cold floor, tears streaming freely down her face. For the first time since the outbreak began, it was finally over. 1 year later, Sarah stood before the newly formed Global Recovery Council in a rebuilt conference hall in Geneva. The world was different now in ways both terrible and beautiful. 3 billion people had survived the outbreak, each carrying trauma that would take generations to fully process and heal. Cities were slowly being rebuilt by communities working together. Governments were reforming with new structures designed to prevent the failures that had allowed the outbreak to spread unchecked. And humanity, humbled by its brush with complete extinction, had learned something precious about itself. "We were saved by science," Sarah told the assembled delegates, her voice strong and clear. The Chen frequency was a triumph of human knowledge and ingenuity. But we were saved first by courage. The courage of ordinary people who refused to accept that darkness was permanent. The courage of those who gave their lives so others could complete the mission. The courage to keep hoping when hope seemed foolish. In the front row, May sat watching with proud eyes. She was 80 now, training to become a doctor so she could help heal the wounds, physical and psychological, that the outbreak had left behind. Marcus sat beside her, finally looking his age again, the weight of responsibility lifted from his shoulders. Outside the conference hall, the sun was shining on a world that had nearly died, but somehow survived. Some nightmares end, and from their endings, new dawns emerge, carrying the promise that humanity will endure whatever darkness comes next. Because that is what humans do. They survive, they adapt, they rebuild, and they never, ever stop hoping for a better tomorrow.